After World War II, Eugene Wigner and Edward Teller convinced President Truman to start a research program on civil defense to protect people against nuclear weapons. It was started at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and a huge amount of research was done, billions of dollars of fine research, which worked out the basic physical elements of civil defense programs all around the world. The engineering at Oak Ridge was used to build the Swiss civil defense system, the Soviet civil defense system, some civil defense systems in other European countries, but never in the United States. There were three presidents, President Truman, President Kennedy, President Reagan, who wanted civil defense systems, but they could never get the Congress to approve the money. People at Oak Ridge were frustrated because these were very fine scientists. Maybe you can close the door. The people at Oak Ridge were frustrated. They were very fine scientists. They did this work. They tested all of these procedures against real nuclear weapons, everything. But the American people weren't getting any defense. So, near the end of the program, the last few years it was in existence, the Director of Civil Defense at Oak Ridge decided to ask a different question. They had answered the question, I'm not giving this talk, but I don't have time for that. They asked a different question. They said, well, let's assume the American people will never have any civil defense as they should. What can an American family do if it's totally unfair? And they worked on this problem for several years. The man who directed the program was Crescent Carney, whom some of you have seen. He used to talk here. Crescent died a few years ago. And so over those years, they worked out what a family could do for itself without any help from its government at all. The procedures, some of them look kind of rinky-dink and things like you work out in your garage, but they're not. They were worked out by the finest scientists at Oak Ridge. They were tested repeatedly. They even tested the instructions. They wrote the instructions, watched families do the instructions, did them over and over and over. Eventually, they put it all together in a book called Nuclear War Survival Skills, which has been published off and on for the last, well, ever since that time. We've published it for the last 20 years.
This is the plan. People don't call the survival as a Bible, and it's not a Bible. It's originally researched and published by the U.S. Department of Energy. Our tax dollars paid for this, and it's the only plan that exists that the government funded. Now, it is not the policy of the government. You know, it's a default plan. In other words, this fellow that talked, Robert Hansen, earlier about this horrible scenario in Washington, D.C. with a 10-kiloton bomb and all the casualties. Well, and he was working for, I guess, Holocene Immune anti-radiation drug, radiation sickness drug. If people had this information, a lot of those, you wouldn't have those kind of casualties. So the real challenge now, I mean, this is an expedient plan. There's a strategy to it. It's intended, its original intent was to circulate it through to all emergency managers and have the Kearney fallout meter specifically. The plans for that would have been published in newspapers around the country. Now the internet has taken care of almost 90% of that plan because this is on the internet now, and along with the plans for the Kearney fallout meter. So the real problem now is motivational. I mean, in other words, how do we motivate America to pick up this plan and understand that's a plan? This is a self-help plan. It's completely self-contained, it's self-training. Now, an emergency manager, this is especially good for an emergency manager. And anybody that works in a first responder, anybody that works in the community in that capacity, could train themselves in small towns with budgets. You know, they've spent all their budgets on regulatory things, and so having money for other things, especially civil defense. Basically, this is pretty much no-cost things that you can do, or extremely low cost. This little sign here, you know, this takes a lot of us maybe down memory lane, you think. Well, Huntsville, Alabama just bought, they spent $3,000 and they bought, or $2,000 and they bought 300 new signs. Except they're this big, this wide, they're metal signs, and they're like this. And they've reactivated their old fallout shelter program. They never really mothballed their civil defense back in 1993 when President Clinton terminated our national civil defense. FEMA defunded, stopped funding all the states. So, you know, the states had all these yellow meters here. And Alabama was one of the few states that did not, that supported their program. Huntsville is, you know, it's well, I'd say it's like a miracle, you know, and that's what we need in this country. If we're going to have any protection or civil defense. And like I say, this book is, this is all we got. But if we'll use it, it's a lot. And the plan in here actually made Huntsville's shelters possible because they use the emergency ventilation, the expedient ventilation that's described in this book for the ventilation of these large public buildings. Otherwise, it would have cost millions of dollars to have generators, backup generators in the buildings to run the ventilation system. So just that alone. And then the other thing Huntsville is doing, they're putting this up on their city website. It's been up on the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine website. But this is the first time it's moving. You know, other organizations have linked to OISM, but they're actually downloading the book on their city website so that you can find it on the city website. Now,